Friends, they did not just call for her resignation, they laughed at her openly, on camera, broadcast live to tens of millions of people across an entire continent. The most powerful unelected woman in Europe stood at that microphone with her hands visibly shaking and her voice audibly breaking, while elected representatives, people whose institutional role required them to at minimum perform the appearance of respecting her authority, laughed out loud directly at her face. And within the same hour that the laughter echoed through the chamber in Strasbourg, 50,000 people were already flooding the streets of Brussels demanding she leave. That number was still climbing when the session ended. There are moments in history that arrive without warning. No dramatic buildup in the weeks before. No leaked intelligence circulating through diplomatic back channels the night prior. No whispered threat that experienced political observers could have tracked and prepared contingency responses for. Just a normal morning that detonates into something irreversible while everyone is still going through the motions of institutional routine. And by the time the people inside that chamber fully understood what they were witnessing, it was already too late for anyone to stop it. What happened inside the European Parliament in Strasbourg on that morning was exactly that kind of moment, the kind that gets frozen permanently in time, the kind that historians return to not just to describe what occurred, but to understand how something so complete, so total, and so publicly devastating could unfold so fast in front of so many people with absolutely nobody possessing the institutional capacity to interrupt it. Von der Leyen walked into that chamber as the most powerful woman in Europe. She walked out as something else entirely. And what happened in the 60 minutes between those two moments changed the European Union forever. Ursula von der Leyen arrived at the European Parliament chamber in Strasbourg at 10:15 in the morning Central European time. She was flanked by her security detail. Her senior advisors moved in tight formation beside her. She carried a folder of prepared remarks, carefully crafted talking points built and stress-tested by the most experienced communications professionals in European institutional politics, designed to navigate whatever challenges the session might produce and emerge with her authority intact and her narrative positioned favorably for the coverage that would follow. She wore the expression she had perfected across decades at the highest levels of European power: composed, confident, slightly distant. The look of a leader who has faced serious pressure before and survived it every single time through a combination of institutional weight, political skill, and the specific unshakable confidence that comes from having bent repeatedly without ever breaking. She had survived budget crises that threatened to fracture the union. She had survived pandemic criticism that questioned her judgment at the moment of Europe's greatest collective vulnerability. She had survived diplomatic failures, transparency scandals, member state rebellions, and opposition campaigns that had deployed every available political weapon against her and still come up short. She had built a reputation over years of high-stakes institutional survival as someone the normal mechanisms of political pressure simply could not reach decisively enough to matter. That reputation was about to be destroyed in front of the largest live audience her institution commands, and she had absolutely no way of seeing it coming. The chamber was filled beyond its normal operating capacity. Every seat occupied, every camera positioned and calibrated, every journalist in attendance carrying the specific alertness of professionals who had received enough signals from enough sources in the preceding days to understand that this session was going to produce something different from the routine institutional proceedings that the official agenda described. Veteran parliamentary correspondents who had covered European proceedings from that building for years described the atmosphere that morning in language they had never previously applied to a chamber session. Not the normal tension of a contested vote where the outcome is uncertain but the process is familiar. Not the controlled friction of a difficult policy debate where both sides have prepared positions and the institutional architecture manages the confrontation toward eventual resolution. Something different. Something that felt less like politics and more like a reckoning that had been accumulating pressure for years without an adequate release valve and had finally, without further warning, found the moment and the room and the audience it needed to arrive. The air in that chamber carried the weight of years of frustration, years of grievance carefully managed and institutionally contained. Years of anger expressed through the approved channels of European democratic procedure and absorbed without consequence by an institution that had learned to process dissent without ever genuinely responding to it. Nobody in that room could have named with precision what was coming, but every person who walked through those doors that morning felt immediately and unmistakably that something was. The session opened with standard procedural formalities that gave nothing away. The chamber president called the meeting to order. The agenda was read aloud in the sequence that every session follows. Everything on the surface appeared exactly as institutional routine required it to appear. Then the first strike landed. It did not come from where anyone in that room expected it to originate. It did not come from the populist opposition bloc that had spent years building its entire political identity around public attacks on her leadership. It did not come from the far-right groupings or the Eurosceptic formations or any of the political forces that the Commission had long since categorized as structural opponents whose criticisms could be absorbed and dismissed through the established mechanism of framing them as anti-European extremism incompatible with the values the Union represents. It came from a German member of the European Parliament, a representative from her own political family, a man who by every measure of institutional alignment was supposed to be her defender, her ally, one of the people whose role in that chamber was to stand between her and the forces that had been working to bring her down. He rose from his seat with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who had made a decision he was fully at peace with and was now simply executing it. And the moment his voice filled that chamber, every person in that room understood simultaneously and with absolute clarity that something historic had just begun and that there was no version of the next hour in which it did not reach its conclusion. He spoke with the controlled fury of a man who had rehearsed every word but felt every syllable with genuine and unmanageable conviction that rehearsal had not diminished. He said he could no longer in good conscience remain silent about what he called the catastrophic and documented failures of the current Commission leadership. He said the European Union had become a laughingstock on the global stage. He said that decades of carefully constructed diplomatic credibility, relationships built over generations, alliances forged through crisis and sacrifice that had given Europe its weight in every room where the world's most consequential decisions are made, had been incinerated in a matter of weeks through arrogance, institutional detachment, and a breathtaking incompetence that the evidence made impossible to attribute to bad luck or difficult circumstances. He said European citizens were suffering in ways that were real, measurable, and devastating, while the leadership in Brussels remained completely and deliberately disconnected from the daily reality that ordinary people were actually living. His voice never broke. It never rose to the kind of emotional register that allows an institution to frame an intervention as passion overcoming judgment. It stayed controlled and deliberate and surgical throughout, and that control made it more devastating than any outburst could have been. Then he said the words, "Ursula von der Leyen must resign immediately for the good of Europe." The reaction was instantaneous and total. Half the chamber erupted in thunderous applause that shook the walls and physically rattled the bones of every person in that room. The other half sat in the suffocating silence of people who understand they are witnessing something they cannot stop and cannot pretend is not happening. Von der Leyen's face went visibly pale. Her hands found the edge of her desk and gripped it. The cameras were already moving, already closing in on her face, already capturing every flicker of shock and every trace of panic crossing her features in real time for the millions of people watching live who were only beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were seeing. The second strike arrived before the applause from the first had reached its peak. A French representative was already on her feet. She did not speak in generalities. She did not traffic in the broad philosophical accusations that can be deflected through institutional language and managed through the Commission's standard crisis communications architecture. She came with specifics. She talked about the diplomatic catastrophe with the United States, the complete and publicly humiliating refusal of the American administration to acknowledge European leadership at the highest levels of international negotiation, the systematic sidelining of Brussels from conversations that determine the security architecture of the entire Western world, while the Commission President's office issued statements about constructive dialogue that every informed observer understood as the language of a government that had been locked out of the room and was describing the door from the outside. She described the degradation of watching decades-old alliances that had guaranteed European security and European relevance on the global stage since the end of the Second World War, crumble in real time because of what she called incompetent, arrogant, and deeply irresponsible handling of relationships that an entire generation of European leaders had dedicated their careers to building and protecting. She accused von der Leyen directly and without hesitation of single-handedly destroying the transatlantic relationship in the time it had taken previous Commission presidents to negotiate a single trade framework. The applause grew louder, and the energy in that chamber shifted from shock into momentum. And momentum at that temperature in a room of that institutional significance does not slow down on its own. The Italian representative rose before the French one had finished. He did not wait for formal recognition from the chamber president. He simply began speaking with the raw edge of someone who had finally and completely run out of patience for the procedural courtesies that had for years allowed his government's grievances to be heard, processed, filed, and ignored without consequence. He talked about economic devastation moving through Italy in waves that showed no sign of receding, factories shutting permanently, unemployment climbing to levels that were destroying entire communities and tearing apart families that had believed the social contract between European citizens and European institutions meant something real. Small businesses collapsing under the weight of regulations designed in Brussels by people who had never run a business, never struggled to make payroll at the end of a difficult month, never watched the work of a lifetime disappear because of a policy decision made by someone sitting in a comfortable office in a building that the consequences of that decision would never reach. He said Italian workers were desperate in ways that the Commission's economic reports did not capture, and its leadership did not comprehend. He said Italian young people were leaving Italy because they saw no future at home, and the person responsible for the policies driving that exodus was standing in that chamber, holding a folder of prepared remarks and a wall of practiced excuses, while real human beings paid the price in ways that could not be undone by any subsequent press release or emergency summit or carefully worded expression of institutional concern. By the time he finished, the chamber was in full revolt. Representatives from Poland, Hungary, the Netherlands, Austria, Spain, one after another, rising from their seats to deliver their verdicts in language that bore no resemblance to the careful parliamentary register that the institution's procedural traditions require. It was brutal. It was direct. It was the language of people who had stopped calculating political consequences and had simply started telling the truth in front of every camera in that building at full volume without a single diplomatic filter remaining. Each speaker fed the energy of the one before, raising the temperature, escalating the assault, pushing the confrontation to levels that veterans in that chamber said they had never witnessed in careers spanning decades of European parliamentary history. And through all of it, von der Leyen sat at her desk with her composure cracking piece by piece under the weight of an assault that her prepared remarks and practiced expressions and decades of institutional survival instinct had given her absolutely nothing to counter. She raised her hand. She attempted to interject. She requested the floor from the chamber president and was at first simply ignored. An act of institutional humiliation with no precedent in the modern history of the European Parliament for a sitting commission president. When she finally reached the microphone, when her voice finally entered the space that had been consuming her for the previous 40 minutes of escalating attack, what happened next was not what her communications team had prepared for, not what her institutional experience had equipped her to manage, and not what any of the millions of people watching live had seen coming. But it was already too late for what happened at that microphone to be the most important thing happening in that moment, because outside those walls, in the the streets of Brussels, something was already underway that the chamber session had ignited but could not control, and that 50,000 people had already decided was no longer a political question waiting for an institutional answer. What did von der Leyen say when she finally reached that microphone? And why did the laughter that followed her words last longer, carry further, and do more permanent damage to the authority of the European Commission than every speech delivered against her in that chamber combined?